and yeah.
Sounds good. Thanks, Kristen. Yeah, hi everyone. I think I've met some of you, but not everyone. So I'm Marie. My pronouns are she, her. Yeah, I've been at Climate Generation for about 2.5 years now. So I'm on the education team and, like Kristen said, do curriculum development as well as professional development with educators. And yeah, I've been helping out with some of the clean review camps and things like that. And so I've been following Clean's work for quite a while, and I'm excited to take on this role and be even more involved. So thanks for having me.
Awesome. So I'm also just kind of showing Marie that this is like a very informal opportunity to be a supporter of this, and usually start out by everyone taking a quick sec to introduce themselves when we're having informal conversations. Because we have a presentation today, I think maybe I'll just ask folks to write in the chat why they're excited to hear this presentation today, so Tim can go back and read that. But I will give everyone a chance now to share any announcements, if they have any brief announcements that they want to share before we jump in. And I'm going to hog the space for a second and just say I have one brief announcement, and that is that I'll be putting in the chat, leading our annual delegation to the COP in November 30th. We have 15 delegates this year that are headed there. 2 of them are teachers, 6 of them are youth, and they are going to be reporting back, some of them from COP. But I'm also hoping that, and I'll send this to the Clean network, anyone from Clean that is at COP is participating and just reporting from Dubai. And I'll give you all a chance to subscribe or read more about it when I put in the chat. And I will pass it to Gina, whose hand is up.
Sweet, thank you. Kristen, I want to say Kristen has been such a champion for Clean for so many years, and a personal fan favorite of mine. I'm a big fan of Kristen, and I'm very sad that she's leaving us, but excited for her new adventure. Also very excited that we have Marie on board. It's going to be great. And thank you all for being here. I just put my introduction in the chat, and my announcement is, as you've all heard, next week is the Accelerating Climate Capacity Engagement and Leadership Summit, convened by Clean. That will be a virtual summit kickoff event next Thursday, November 16th. And I really want everyone to share this and register and come and be involved. I want everyone that's able to come and hear about what's going on in the community and take part in some amazing working groups that are happening. So I'll put the registration link in the chat. Please consider coming and please share.
Thanks, Gina. Jim, your hand is up.
Yes, and I'd like to make an announcement that we've been looking for the appropriate Clean call where students would have a place, would be engaged, where it's worth them to be in the Clean call, at least for a while. You will see Victoria Bampo, who is professor at Bard High School in Washington, D.C. Southeast, with part of her climate class that teaches climate science as an elective course 5 days a week for the entire semester. And it will be repeating it each semester. Their school works with a Lowell school, where also we have it taught 2 days a week. Both schools just had field trips to the Smithsonian Museum Natural History, where that is a major partner with us. We want to work with Clean on this, but we're hoping that for Tim, as you speak of what it would be like as we scale up, that we can help provide you with examples you can point to, that yours is not a pipe dream. This is not something that can't be done or can only be done in your school in Michigan. It is being done in other schools. And by the way, we just refreshed our images of the White House and the Capitol and the Smithsonian's, where we have teams on 4 countries and 7 states, all working to make those buildings energy efficient as a climate action, working together. Those other programs are out of school informal education and we're providing the two anchor in schools, two schools. Sorry for the long announcement, but I'm going to think if the Clean Network doesn't think it's important to have Victoria Mampo in her class here, we're doing something awfully wrong. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Welcome to your students, Ms. Bampo.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, and you all that are watching us, please ask questions, and this is for you too. And also tell us what would make this more interesting, I think, or helpful to your class, because that's really the point, right? So sit back and listen, but we also want you to be able to participate. And I would love to be more intentional about that, thinking about it into the future too. That's cool. I love that you're here. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Anyone else have an quick announcement? All right, well, I am gonna turn it over to Tim. Just to do a little introduction, because I have the information in front of me, but Tim is a PhD student at the University of Michigan in the School for Environment and Sustainability, and he's been doing research on how to get schools to implement high quality and comprehensive climate change education that builds societal response on top of learning climate science. And he is going to talk through the process of how he went about designing and implementing a course for high school students, what worked, what didn't work. And I'm really excited to hear what you have to share today, Tim. What do you need from us? Are you all set up to do what you need to do?
I think we should be good. Can you guys see my screen?
Yep, looks good.
All righty. Well, thank you guys so much for having me to come talk to you today. And I'm really excited, particularly to see Jim and Victoria here. I know sometimes as it can feel a little bit lonely, but there are schools that are doing this. There are places where this is working, and if we can do it in a handful of places around the country, there's no reason why we can't do it everywhere. And so that's kind of what we're looking at, is trying to figure out methods of climate education that actually will be scalable and actually will result in positive outcomes for our students and our society. I want to start by telling a little bit of a story of why I got into this, because I think stories are a really powerful way to share and communicate information. I was kind of always interested in climate change, but when I was an undergrad, I took this study abroad in Nicaragua, and I had two experiences there that really cemented for me how important this work was. And the first happened with this man you see here, Oscar, and I arrived in this little village on the Caribbean coast, and I was staying with him. And he was so excited because he showed me that they had just gotten a freezer, and they had a windmill and batteries, and they had a freezer, and he thought it was the coolest thing. And he asked if I thought it was the coolest thing. I thought it was the coolest thing. He asked me if I had one. I told him I had a freezer, and it was great. We talked about having a freezer. And I went fishing with him a few days later, and I took this picture, and he was asking me, where Detroit actually was, because that's where I was living at the time, and I asked, he knew where Miami was, and I told him it was as far north of Miami as Miami was north of where he was. And he says, "Is that cold there?" And I said, "Well, when I left, it was like 6 Fahrenheit. So that's significantly below 0 Celsius. And he looked at me puzzling. He said, "But you have a freezer." I said, "Yeah, I have a freezer." He says, "Do you use the freezer?" And I said, "Yes." And he asked me why. And I said, "I didn't know." Because of course my grandmother in the winter always put the food on in her garage. A few months later, I was staying with him again, this time not on study abroad, but I was doing a research project. And I was working on amphibians, and his brother was talking to me, and I said, "Edgar, what's up with the rains? Why are there no rains here?" I came to my research. He said, "You don't know why there's no rains. It's climate change. And it's messed up our crops." And you guys did it. And there's a pretty rough moment, right? Where we're starting to see that our actions have impacts on real people living real lives that we really care about. So after I became a high school teacher, I got really into this. Was we were starting to come up with a plan for how to teach climate. We started looking at what other places were doing. We weren't finding a lot of good examples of climate ed around the country. We know that Americans are interested in learning about climate change. We knew that we as a high school had an opportunity to provide that. We knew that climate change shows up in the next generation science standards. But we also know that schools don't really teach it that much. We've, for the most part, have dropped earth science. We know that we kind of tuck it in a little bit in physics or chemistry or biology. And when we do that, when we tuck climate change into different places, it ends up with students never getting a real strong picture of the climate problem overall. They get fragments and they don't get a cohesive story at best. And at worst, when you see things in little pieces and you don't get a message that's overarching, it can leave you with a lot of anxiety, problems. Climate anxiety is a real concern, and it can be made worse when you approach climate education the wrong way. And the final thing that we realized is that when you put climate change into a science class that teaches just science, you really miss out on huge aspects of the climate problem, which involve climate justice and climate action. There was a book that came out a year ago called Miseducation: How Climate Change is Taught in America, which some of you may have read. And it tells a pretty depressing story about climate change education gone wrong. And not only do I think that doesn't have to happen, I actually don't think that that's really the driving story of what's happening in the United States today. I think that there are these cases and examples where people are teaching this incorrectly, but I think for the most part, it's kind of ignored. And we're going to figure out how to stop that hiding from the problem. So when we were putting together a class, we decided to come up with a list of all of the features of high quality climate change education that we wanted to incorporate. We read a lot of literature, and we decided that it should leave students capable of engaging in discourse. It should address mitigation and adaptation. And that adaptation part, I think, is really crucial for helping students cope with what they're learning about. It should increase adaptive capacity and mitigation capacity of communities, help students make informed decisions, engaging and relevant. All of these things, a lot of them are things that we know are just good educational practices in general. But we couldn't find anything that did all of those. We looked for climate education resources. They exist all over the place. There's lots of good ones, but they all miss some of the point. None of them combined together told this complete story in a way that addressed those things. And that made it really hard as a teacher to just pick something up and use. If we really wanted to accomplish all of those things, we couldn't just grab a lesson from PhET or from CLEAN or a modeling activity from Sage Modeler. Just it didn't raise to the occasion. So we built our own. And we built our own to try to address this problem. How do I get school administration to encourage teaching of climate change, which may be seen as divisive, even though for the most part, the teaching of it is kind of supported in theory. There's a new project out from the North American Association of Environmental Education this year. It says that school admin's on board, which means it's time. By teachers who don't know a ton about it, haven't had a lot of professional development on this topic, don't want to spend their summers getting professional development on the subject, and they're still shying away from it. So we can believe there's 3 ways to do that. The 3 options that we came up with for how you could actually do this are: 1, you could integrate the climate change across the curriculum, which there's a really good example from the Lowell School with their humanities project of doing this. And you can show that climate change is important. It impacts all aspects of students' lives. It ensures exposure to all students at the school. There's a lot of really good things about this, but it does have drawbacks. You need content knowledge and pedagogical content knowledge by all teachers across all subjects, which requires huge amounts of professional development. You have to deal with this problem of a diffusion of responsibility, where if all teachers think it's being taught somewhere else, maybe if they drop a bit of it, it doesn't make that big of a difference because someone else will pick up the pieces, which we know doesn't happen. But potentially the largest problem is it separates spatially and temporally impacts of climate change from measures to address it and solutions. The second one, which is the one that I ended up really focusing on, is implementing a standalone climate change course. In the grand scheme of things, it was actually fairly easy to implement. I just had to create a curriculum, convince my principal and the school board to let us do it, and we did it. It had the advantage of helping students gain a cohesive storyline. It was able to be framed for student agency, and it only required one person, one teacher at the school to be fully invested in the process. And while it'd be more ideal if everybody was working together on this, in the short term, that might not be the most feasible thing in all situations. The downside of that approach is that it potentially limits exposure to students who are already interested, and it limits the scope of time to which students are exposed to climate change from potentially their entire educational experience down to 1 semester or 1 year. And then the third version is where you do climate education or climate action as part of an extracurricular activity. And in this version, you have more freedom to do things that can't be done in normal classes. It allows the ability to focus, but it does have the potential to limit exposure to those privileged enough to participate in extracurriculars. And it relies upon a whole bunch of things that are difficult to foster, but really good when you get right. It involves having to figure out volunteers and funding sources and all of these things, which is going to be really powerful, but it's challenging. And all these methods, all these opportunities are really good, and different schools might end up settling on different ones as what works best for them. What works best in one group might be doing this. You have a school that has a really strong community of professional development and collaboration, and maybe you want to take this on. Or you're in a school that's willing to let teachers try whatever, but it's not really interested in group projects, and maybe this is the choice for you. My students are working on this extracurricular angle outside of the climate class, and we put on this symposium, and in it, James Hansen came and talked to us, and I asked him about my students and their worries about climate change and what I should do about that as a teacher. And he said they shouldn't worry, they should just fix it. And I think that really gets to the heart of what we need to make sure that our climate education is doing. We're not just teaching climate science. We have an aspect of it that gets to the fixing it. And when you get to the fixing it, a lot of the worry goes away. A lot of the anxiety tends to become backgrounded. I know that my climate anxiety was a lot higher before I started actually working with climate education full time. And as I was doing that more and more and more, I started to be worried about it less and less because I'm doing something. If any of you want to know more about climate anxiety and how it can relate to our understandings of things, I highly recommend Field Guide to Climate Anxiety by Sarah Ray. It's a really good book that, as you're designing your educational interventions, will really help you do less harm to your students' mental states, because there's a real risk of that when you approach things in a doom or gloom way, or also a everything's going to be fine, there's no need to worry approach. So we created this class we called Honors Global Climate Change, and I formed it with the goal of meeting the standards of high quality climate education that we listed earlier. I formed a collaboration with a professor at the University of Michigan, and we reworked some of the stuff from his classes, and we produced a semester-long elective class, which we offered 4 years ago now for the first time, and over half of the students at the school signed up for it, which really, really went to support the idea that there's a demand for this, but it also put a lot of pressure on to do a good job. And so we taught the class, and you can see some of the commentary from the students in the post-class survey up on the screen. But I really want to highlight for you that the students thought that having this as a class was very worthwhile. I don't know what everybody else's sophomore chemistry classes evaluations looked like, but mine didn't look like this when I got them back at the end of the semester. All of the students think that other schools should be offering climate classes. So of all the students who answered the survey, a few of them didn't, but they all did. They all thought this was a worthwhile thing. And as schools are trying to design classes and structures that students want that's meaningful to them, I think this is a really good example that school administration can take. That this is something they can do to get their students to want to be in school and to want to be studying and learning things at a rigorous level. So what we did was we ended up breaking up climate change into 3 units. One was about understanding climate and how it's changing. One was about the impacts of climate change, and one was about how to do it, what to do about it. And I do want to note that while this was a framework, we did try to incorporate bits of Unit 3 throughout the process. So as students were learning about how the climate's changing, we keep bringing up examples of how things can be done, what actions could be taken, but then really focused in all full-time on it in the final third of the class. We also kept 3 projects going in the background all the time. One we based around current events, because since climate change is one of the most important things happening every day there's important climate change related news. And so we had students reading articles from either popular or scientific sources and sharing them out with the class. And we did that every day. Students took turns, and they really liked to see that people were talking about it, because as one student mentioned in one of their evaluations, they took the class because climate change had always been a taboo topic for them. It was something that they weren't allowed to discuss. And they thought that this was a really good opportunity to do this. And by doing the current events, they were able to see that people are talking about climate change, that this is something that's happening, and it really gave them an avenue of excitement. For the class, we used the IPCC summary report as our text. And as we read through those and used those and analyzed graphs and figures, one student mentioned, "Wow, I didn't know it was possible for someone to know so much about something." And another student mentioned that they felt like they were being let in on a secret by getting to read the real thing and not a dumbed down version. Because it turns out that when students really, really want to know something, you can give them stuff at a high level. And the third thing we had our project. And this is the action piece that I think really helped make the class meaningful. And for that, we had students break into groups and they had to design their own project, although I gave them a bunch of different options of things that they could do. Yeah, Gleesa's great. We gave them a whole bunch of options of things they could do. One of which was they could write a climate mitigation or adaptation plan for their city, which they could submit to relevant person in their city government, whether it's the mayor, city council, city manager. They could design a climate adaptation plan for a natural area nearby. A couple groups worked with the local transportation department to figure out the impacts of the local busing system. A couple groups have over the years worked with the school on energy saving and management, and all these different projects students worked on throughout the semester, and we had time in class and kept sharing out and collaborating with each other as we learned about it. And students felt that that was really, really worthwhile. Having an open-ended project provides some benefits and some costs. One of the benefits is the students are really excited. They have ownership over it. One of the drawbacks of doing that is that you lose a little bit of control over what's happening, and you have to accept that some students are going to really want to do projects that aren't necessarily attainable or too easy. The other side is how early you can introduce a project. So the earlier you introduce a project, the more time they're going to have to work on it, but the less background knowledge they'll have. And so they can create better projects if you start them later in the semester. But they can produce more complete projects if you start them earlier. And a couple students suggested that that could be solved by just making the class last a full year instead of a semester, which I kind of agreed with. So in the first unit of the class, we did a lot of understanding how climate works, how atmospheric circulation works, energy transfer works, how light works. We did a bunch of modeling. We learned about albedo, and students did a lot of really fun labs that they enjoyed. And I think a lot of times this is kind of just a more in-depth version of where climate education tends to end. But once you're able to be, once we had this kind of background, we're really able to get into impacts of climate change on human health, on sea level, on ocean acidification. And you don't just stop by saying, look, we flood. We actually look at economics of places, impacts on people, how many people are displaced, what can you do about this, impacts for migration. You can go into real detail when you have the time to, instead of saying that sea level rise happens when land ice melts and you have thermal expansion of water. When you expand past that to what are the impacts of it, how does that impact people, you really gain a lot of power for the students. But you can't do that in a 45-minute class period, right? It takes a week. It takes time to do those things. You can learn that the oceans become more acidic when carbon dioxide dissolves in them in one class period in your chemistry class. But if you stop there, it's not meaningful. It doesn't become meaningful until you learn, so what happens when coral reefs break down? How does that impact the ecosystems? How does it impact the people who live on lands that are behind them? And there's some really good activities that you can do with these things, but they take more time than is generally allocated to it. In our third unit, we talked about what to do about climate change. And I think this is the part where you have to be really intentional about things, because a lot of students come in with this idea that we can solve climate change by all just switching to electric cars. We all stop driving, or we just get solar panels. But of course, any of those things doesn't actually solve the problem, because you essentially have to stop putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere from all of these different sectors. And you need a more systems thinking approach. And you can talk about that over the course of weeks, and you can learn about different policy options for how to address that. But you don't get that in little pieces. And I think the En-ROADS Climate Simulator is a really good foundation for a really good multi-day lesson sequence where students are able to actually build in their plans. And then we talk about human behavior, and this is people get uncomfortable, and you talk about human behavior and ethics, and what does it mean to live in a society. Sorry, I was just reading the comments. And what does it actually mean to live in a society that's taken these actions? So that's kind of the class. And now I'm not teaching it anymore. I've moved on. I've gone to the University of Michigan. I'm trying to figure out how to get other schools to be able to create relevant programs for themselves. I passed off the class to a new teacher. It's still going on. It's still going strong. They still have their after school club, which I help with. But if you pick this up, it's in the slides. You can click on it. You can go there. I want to let you know that this would need refinement and tailoring because it was made by me for my students. And the climate education is not a one size fits all thing. What's needed at a rural school in Western Michigan might be different than what's needed at an urban school in DC. But I think it's a framework that might be valuable. And at this point, I kind of just want to ask you guys if you have any questions that you want to talk about. I'm going to put this collage up. Every day in the class, I had a quote from somebody about climate change who's an influential person, not necessarily a great role model or a bad role model, but somebody who's kind of influential to provide some inspiration. So as while we look at questions that we have, I'm going to give you guys this collage to inspire your questions as we talk about them for the last 10 minutes we have.
Thanks, Tim. What kind of questions do folks have? Sounds like a really intentionally developed curriculum. I'm still mulling on some things in my head, but do anyone have any questions they want to ask? Eric.
Thanks, Kristen. And yeah, thanks for a great presentation. One question I have is about sort of the sequencing. I appreciate the 3 kind of buckets, and sort of that's, you know, a big third of the curriculum being solutions-based. We're working on this 4th grade curriculum in California as part of a K-12 literacy project for the state that's being driven by 10 Strands. And what we've done with the unit is kind of embed solutions throughout. So like from day one, we kind of uplift and showcase, you know, places, even if we're talking about basic climate literacy or energy literacy in the case of our unit, or the issues, the challenges, the impacts. Throughout, we've got these case studies, and we have the students, it's 15 units for 4th grade specifically, but throughout, every time there's an opportunity for students to say, oh, look at what that person did when the power went out. Look at what that person did during that extreme weather event. Look how they were displaying sort of this act of resilience, or they said, oh, I should prepare an emergency kit, or I should, you know, conserve energy, whatever it is. So just kind of that there's a through line of solution, because sometimes I found, as you were saying, if you lead with just the science or just the gloom and doom, it really exacerbates that eco-anxiety, climate anxiety. But so that's one thought I had, was just through line of solutions, you know.
Yeah. So I think so. I think it's really context specific, and I really agree with you. So this is why I point out that you can't just use it as written. When we first started piloting this little climate unit years before we turned it into a class, we had some concern about from some stakeholders that we were trying to indoctrinate the students in solutions, or that we were doing things in orders that drove some groups of people away. And what we figured out was that if we waited to talk about solutions and justice until the students demanded it, then it made it really powerful. So if I ignored that in the beginning, and then the student says, why aren't we doing this? Why aren't we talking about this? What's the problem? And as soon as they do that, I can switch. That worked well in my context, where I had a lot of I was in a pretty red county, with a lot of students from rural areas, and that worked really well. When we tried it the other way, we had problems. I do recognize that if you're dealing with students, that's not necessarily a concern, then I might even completely front load the look at these things that people are doing. Why might they be doing that? And really front load it. But where I was and the people who I was working with, at least in the beginning, was not a thing for us. Rachel?
Thanks, Tim. Great presentation. Thank you for sharing. I have really just a quick question. I noticed that you said that you had published your work in the Science Teacher. I was curious if you could just drop in the chat, maybe the DOI or some kind of quick reference that I can look up. I'd love to read it.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I will. Yeah, I will do that for you. We got a question from Jim. Historically, one of the most used tools to dismiss what most advanced schools are doing is to characterize their work as unscalable. Unless something happens thousands or one schools, simply doesn't matter. Their favorite ploy, yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's right. That's the argument. We have, of course, all these little case studies of schools doing things, like we see examples today. A good story here is New Jersey, right? We've got the momentum. It's starting to show up, and I think it's there. With the scalability issue, you have to come around past this idea that not every school has somebody who has the content knowledge today or the desire today to do something like this. And every school needs somebody like that. And how do you actually make that happen? And I think professional development has a place there, but it can't be professional development that occurs optionally over the summer if you want to participate in it, because we know that teachers aren't going to do that. But if you can get school districts to make one of their their focus one year, last year we did literacy. This year the focus of our school is DEI or equitable grading practices. Maybe we can find a way to get a couple schools to hit their theme being climate ed, and kind of like the Lowell School, their approach with their humanities curriculum. And maybe there's an avenue to scale that there, but I don't fully know. Hopefully in a couple of years, I'll have a better answer for you on that.
Clean.
Thank you. I have a few questions. So this was an elective of choice, right? Were you mostly seeing like juniors and seniors taking this class?
It was all juniors and seniors because so the school I taught at was a physics first school.
Mm-hmm.
So they did physics as freshmen, and then chem and bio as a sophomore. There you go. There's the link to the article. And so by making it a juniors and seniors class, everybody who is in it had already taken physics, bio, and chem.
Okay.
And that formed a really good basis. So everybody theoretically knew about the electromagnetic spectrum. Right? They know about a little bit about ecosystem dynamics. They know about evolution and extinction. ideally when they come in. They know about acids and bases, right? So that makes ocean acidification easier when they already know what a buffer is.
And so then was this end up being a science credit for them? I know it was meant to be interdisciplinary.
It was a science credit. But I think that was not necessarily based on class content or structure. That was based on, I was the science teacher. It was taught in my department. I think it'd be way cooler if you could have a class like this co-taught by somebody from the social studies department. Of course, that presents the challenge of it requires 2 teachers, and teachers are in short supply at the moment, and it's expensive to do things like that.
Yeah.
But it was listed as a science class.
Okay. And the last question that I have is, you mentioned that you gave them a lot of options for projects that they could work on throughout the semester. And I was wondering if you had the option, or if some students came up with their own project, really thinking about maybe a problem that you hadn't thought about that they went for, or did they mostly choose one of the ones you had offered?
They mostly chose from a list of things that I suggested. Groups that deviated had mixed success. So one of the groups decided that so I was teaching in Battle Creek, Michigan, home to Kellogg's cereal, and they wanted their project to be to get Kellogg's to put a green roof on all of their buildings, which is a very ambitious semester goal. For multiple reasons. One is that's a multi-year project at best, and 2, it's their goal was to get them to do it, not to interact with them about doing it, and so they made the outcome of their project dependent on somebody else's behavior. So we worked a lot on how to make your project not about getting that change, but about how to interact with trying to get that change. A lot of students are like, I want to make my project going and talking to an elementary school class. And I think that students want to do things like that, or they want to make it like they want to make a climate change the game or something, because it's comfortable to them. Like I'm going to make this like a project in another class. And I've tried to kindly reject those ideas by asking, like, what are the impacts and the outcomes of this going to be? But most people kind of stuck to the prompts, which were pretty good. I think a lot of them, particularly the ones where they talked to cities and did climate plans for cities or developed aspects of climate plans for cities, really helped them understand the role that policy plays in this. A lot of the students come in thinking that climate change is going to be solved or not solved by everybody deciding to do the right thing. And by helping them engage in a policy planning, really helped them see that that's not necessarily how we're going to solve things. You trade off days, 2 sections with the teacher. I think that's an incredible idea. That's really cool in the chat.
Yeah, you were mentioning about, having 2 teachers for 1 class, but I'm just imagining like block scheduling 4 days a week. If there were 2 sections and then a science teacher and a social studies teacher switched off, then you end up with exposure to both ways of thinking, but also not taking 2 teachers for 1 class, which is probably out of everyone's budget.
Yeah. I think that's a really, really good idea, and It's the power of collaboration right there and talking about ideas and sharing with each other. That's really cool.
Does anyone else have any questions for Tim?
Tim, I didn't get your email down. Would you put it in the chat if you haven't already? I really like this.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing so much. This is great. I'm just thinking how I can support some teachers in Alaska to make this happen.
Yeah, and yeah, so I put my email in, and I'm happy to give materials or ideas or talk things through with anybody who wants to in the short time frame. In a longer time frame, and in like 2 years, I'm going to try to set up some sorts of pilot project or PD program with a few schools to try to look at what implementing this would be like on a scale. And so if people are interested in participating with things, I'd be happy to talk about that with anybody in that capacity. So, reach out for anything if you want it. All right, Jim.
Hey, Tim. And by the way, disclosure for people, Tim and I have talked a good deal, and we have agreed to be in connection and working. I think what Tim is doing is incredible. I did ask him, is he sure he wants to stop being a high school teacher, because there's not that many of us are doing what he does. And given how well he's doing what he's doing, I'm okay with you leaving the profession to go to the other level of the profession. So my question would be of and I think you gave an indication of it in your program, in your what you work to do. Indeed, do you mean to highlight examples of schools that have come on board and have done this, to sort of answer a question I think is on people's mind, is what's going on at these schools that they're doing it when it is hardly happening at all in the rest of the country? What are they doing different? What are their conditions? Who are their funders? How do they do this thing? How do they have it? To that question, by the way, I will also say that because I've been doing this for 25 years and encountered such arguments from all over the place that, well, what you're doing isn't scalable, so it doesn't matter. What really matters is digital media. That's the way of the future. We need to teach students by digital media, because then you can reach 1 million students. And what did we learn from COVID about that approach? Okay, so that those that have power don't always know the best thing. We need to look at these other ones. But anyway, for 25 years, I've watched how programs that have come up from the grassroots are suppressed and eclipsed. They're ignored because they're not what the oil companies or some government agent doesn't think should happen. So I'm giving you some background on how important it is. I think if you do that, you do highlight the small ones, who has started this even before we get to 10,000.
Yeah. So I think the first thing is thank you for that conversation last year about the hazards of leaving. I thought about that a lot, and so I've tried to do my best to set the person who took over my spot up for success, and continuing to interact there, because I don't want that project to fail, because I don't want your fear to come true there. And that really foreground that in my mind. Yeah, the thing I keep thinking about is climate change is not going to be just solved by a technological fix. It's going to be solved by people and communities and relationships on top of all these other things. And if we're going to solve climate change that way, we shouldn't expect to be able to solve the education aspect without engaging in the human portion as well. So the idea that you're just going to create a couple of massive open online courses and say we solved the climate education problem isn't going to do it. All it's going to do is make you feel good about yourself for putting this out there. There's tons of climate education resources that exist online, and they're not used. And so the only, as far as I can tell, the only way to solve the problem is to actually use the grassroots human approach of going about it. And the thing about what's the deal with these schools that are able to do it, I think it's a really important thing to thing to investigate. And there could be some major resource component to it that's an big obstacle, or it also might be exposure, and people don't know this is a possibility. There's people who are trying to suppress it so that way somebody in some other school doesn't find out that, oh, we started a forensic science class, we could start a climate class too, or something along those lines. But I think it's just going to be really important to talk about and try to get schools aware of it and give them a framework that they can potentially pick up and run with. So it's not so difficult if somebody decides they want to give it a whirl. Because I've talked to a lot of teachers who are interested in doing things at their school, but they don't really know where to start. And I think we can make inroads there.
Well, thanks everyone for the great conversation. Awesome presentation, Tim. And I hope everyone has a great day. Unless there's any last remarks, we can remember to sign up and share the summit. Right, Gina?
Please, that'd be great.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is great, Tim.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
All right, well, thanks everyone. Take care.
Thanks, Kristen.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.